Uh, okay. I will tell you quickly, for those of you who didn't really follow what has happened since October 7 last year and the last year. I will, part 3 will be something in the way of like why Israel is in the best shape that it's ever been in 2024. And part 4 will be why Israel is in its worst shape since it's ever been. So I'm gonna counter myself. Part 5, I wrote the future. When I try to predict it, I don't know, maybe a quick, just my own thoughts about the immediate future and the long run. And then part 6 and 7 are connected. 6 is where you ask questions, and 7 is where, depending on the questions, I give the answers. So, and then I took some notes for what I assume will be some questions and answers. So, and then the one thing I always say, my dad always used to say to me, and I never understood till I was an adult, there's nothing really black and white about the Middle East. Wherever you talk to anyone about anything that has to do with the Middle East, just always remember there's nothing that's ever black and white. It's a lot of gray. You see what I just did there? I said something that is black and white, and then so there is actually quite a lot of things that are black and white. But anyways, so I am what you would say a typical typical first generation Israeli. I was born to parents, Jewish parents who came to Israel, and I'm like a classic. I was born in 1965 when the country was 18 years old. My father, his family is a classic Eastern European. They escaped from Russia to Poland, from Poland to Germany, where his siblings were born, and then to France when he was born. After Hitler took power in Germany, they realized what's going to happen. They moved to France. He was born in France. And then they kept running away from whatever it was, Nazis, fascists. When my dad was 7, he was smuggled, for lack of a better word, smuggled across the border from France to Switzerland with his brother. He was 7, his brother was 9. The American Red Cross literally walked him over the Alps. And he was in a orphanage. It was kids, and he was in Switzerland for 2.5 years, not really knowing if the family survived back in Lyon in France. They did, the immediate family did, the rest did not. They were hiding in a house in Lyon, and a good Christian doorman would smuggle food for them. Never left the apartment for 2.5 years. So my dad came back after the war, reunited with his family, grew up kind of poor, at some point skipped school, helped his dad, and at the age of 18 or 19 decided Jews should move to Israel. By then I'm talking 1952, 53. My mother, different type of persecution, anti-Semitism. She grew up in Egypt, in Alexandria, a pretty good, quiet, nice community of Jews living along Muslims and Christians in Alexandria. And then one day in 1952, President Jamal Abdel Nasser decided all Jews should be gone, gives them 3 to 6 weeks to pack their things. My mom was the youngest of 5 sisters, and they all packed their stuff and go. Remember that later if we talk about ethnic cleansing that we hear a lot about now, talk about. And my mom in some ways is the story of pretty much all these countries you see, including all of North Africa, you know, Jews from Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, and then of course Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey. In the early 50s, that's pretty much their story, and they all basically one or another kicked out for no reason. So that's how my parents met in the early 50s, and they all go to Israel and decide to live in a kibbutz. What's a kibbutz? It's a different lecture, but it's a community village, farming based, up in the Galilee Mountains, on the border with Lebanon. So that's like right here, right in the middle. And that's where I was born. That's where I lived all my childhood. That is actually where my dad and my brother lives till this very day. Not really, we'll get to that in a moment. He's been evacuated, but that's where I was born and raised, and in a very secular environment. A kibbutz is kind of liberal, usually left-wing, high on working ethics, education, public service, good, valuable service in the military, and so on. So I was born and raised in the kibbutz. Came out totally normal. We joke about it. I grew up in a children's homes, if you've heard of that term, but and then like most Israelis, I went to the army service in the early 80s, right towards the end of the war in Lebanon and the first Intifada in 87. And I ended up staying for almost 5 years since I became because I became an officer in the army. So that's a little bit about me and my background, and you know, I grew up in a home that's very pro-Israel. My dad was an envoy 3 times in Rome, in Milan, and with the Jewish Agency, connecting Jewish communities around the world with Israel. He and my mom both loved Israel, still love it. My mom passed away many years ago, but still really in love with the idea, Zionism, and that place for Jews should be in Israel. So that's a little bit about me and how I see things. Number 2, October 7 was a really big, I'm assuming most of you read what happened on October 7 last year. October 7 changed a lot of things in the way we see things in Israel, whether you're right, left, or somewhere in the middle. If you want to imagine something like a 9/11 that happened over here, that people remember the before and the after, October 7 was kind of like that. And I'm saying that even though Israel in 75 years of existence had like 7 wars and intifadas, which is uprising, it has all kinds of security issues. But October 7 was a real shock to the system. It was the day when Palestinians from Hamas, people from Gaza, stormed the border, took hostages, about 100 of them still being held in Gaza, killed about 1,200, 1,300 Israeli. In fact, a lot of them from kibbutzim along the border. And since then, Israel had found itself engaged in maybe uniquely almost 7 fronts all at one time. See if I can memorize it. It's Hamas from Gaza. It's the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. It's Iran through Iran, and it's Iraqis through Iraq. It's Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's out of the blue, the Houthis came from Yemen. They have some issues, and I think I named all 7. Iran is through Iran, and Iran is through Hezbollah. But that's pretty much what's connecting all of those groups. They're all Iranian funded, most of them Iranian backed for no reason. Personally, all of north of Israel, pretty much a strip of like 5 miles, had to be evacuated. So my dad just celebrated his 90th birthday, is stuck in some hotel in Tiberias for over a year now. My brother and his family, the whole kibbutz basically had to be evacuated and put in a hotel. The state of Israel is paying for that so far, but everyone who's been evacuated, I think it's about something like 120,000 Israelis from the south and the north that have been evacuated from areas that are just deemed unsafe. By the way, again, Lebanon and Israel have seen war at least 4 times. Never there has been any evacuation. There's shelters, there's all kinds of missiles protecting it, but this is the very first time that a whole kibbutz had to evacuate kids, adults, yeah, I talk to him every day. He's very desperate to go home. It could be worse. He's in a hotel. There's 3 meals a day. There's activities. There's all of that. But I think it's a little bit underreported in any news report that I see. The daily barrage of missiles falling on Israel, literally every day from many fronts, and the fact that there's a lot of people who still cannot go back to their place. Just by the way, when I grew up, the Israeli-Lebanese border is very beautiful. It's very quiet, so it was very peaceful. When we drove to the apple fields, you could wave to the farmers on the other side of the fence. On a good day, when the wind is going north to south, you could hear the muazzin from the mosque saying the prayer from the Arab village on the other side of the border, in the Lebanese village, was pretty nice and beautiful, and it was a good place to live. Jason, you want to add something?
Just to put things in perspective. Thank you, by the way, for the introduction. Israel is such a small country. It's
correct.
The size of New Jersey, relatively speaking, and so to have 1,000 people die in one day, which is like roughly 1% of the population,
correct,
more or less, right? That would be the equivalent of 3.5 million Americans dying in one day, right? I mean, insane in terms of the perspective of how intense that was for the people. And and another point, just with the geography, I mean, it looks relatively big in that picture. I mean, it's a small country. Think about, if it's the size of New Jersey, think of it as if shells were, bombs were falling, and like the first, like, from Bergen County, on the border of Pennsylvania down, it'd be like, that's why when people were evacuated from the north, it's a big piece of the country that people had to leave their homes, and then they haven't been back. And so there's a sense of, if I understand, there's a sense of claustrophobia.
Correct. Israel has shrunk even more than what it is. There's areas in the north you can go. There's areas in the south you cannot go. Everything is all of a sudden between, like,
And so I think we're going to talk about the response to the Hamas attacks.
Right. And
I think there's the two perspectives that is hard for us as Americans to understand, is the sense of loss, the magnitude of the loss,
right,
and also the kind of like the lack of space. I think has informed the response for people inside the country. So, anyways,
and I'll add to that, because you're right. I mentioned the comparison to 9/11. Everybody in Israel, in many ways, has been impacted by October 7th. Every single person has somebody they know, family who's been evacuated, a son who's been recruited back to the army, anyone in Israel by now has ran to a shelter 10 or 20 times, no matter if it's Tel Aviv or Haifa. But it's really, as opposed to maybe 9/11 that had, with all due respect, an impact on a certain amount of people, this specific one has really changed everything in that respect, in the daily safety feeling. I said I'll say why Israel is in the best shape as part 3. First of all, before October 7th, Israel was really coming to a situation where they would have a position of confidence, I call it. There was negotiations with Bahrain, with Sudan, with the UAE. Israel has a friendly relationship with both Russia and the US, which is a little bit unusual. There's a working relationship with the Palestinian Authority, with Jordan, with Egypt. In many ways, it still felt as a military superpower to anybody in the region, technologically. And again, this is until October 7th, things have a little bit changed. The economic strength of Israel was by far superior, not only to the countries in the area, but worldwide. Israel is, I think, has 135 companies traded in the stock exchange in New York. I think it's 4th in the world, behind US, Canada, and China. The GDP, 13th in the world. There's all kinds of, it's high-tech based, which is the future. There's a lot of economic strength in Israel that really, really helped to be in for a country that's only 75, 76 years old. And there's a lot of books written about it. However, that's part number 4. The economy, the cost of the war is estimated at about 67 billion. It will be 67 billion by the end of the year. That's a lot of money for any country. With all due respect to the aid Israel gets or doesn't get from the US or other countries, it's a lot of money. And Jason, maybe you can talk about it. There's those ratings agencies that are downgrading the debt, and the growth of Israel that was very high, it's now at an all-time low.
Yeah, the economy
because of that.
Yeah.
And the economy, right? I don't. This has been the longest and most expensive war that Israel has ever had in 76 years by far. And then socially, people have found there's a mental health crisis. There's increase in suicide. There's I wrote here fear of displaced people, no tourism, and I actually looked it up this morning, a record, what's the opposite of immigration? Emigration? Like 40,000 people, which for Israel is a lot, 41,000 leaving this year alone so far. May not sound like a big number, but for Israel, it's a lot. And what I found interesting is that it says the median age is 31. So that's the people you need to stay. The professors, the lawyers, the doctors, all of those. So that's kind of the good and the bad. I find it when I go to Israel every time because my family, I always see it. It's like the best and the worst. It's like the booming economy, the roads, the housing, and at the same time, there's some areas that are totally being left out. Part 5, the future. I would be sitting here, right, if I knew what the future is. But I can tell you that the immediate future, it's complex. There's a prime minister, liked or not liked, who basically does whatever he wants right now. Benjamin Netanyahu has been in power for a long time. Seems to be no rush to solve a lot of those problems. I know it sounds harsh. I'm trying to say it as objectively as possible. Seems like he's not in a rush to finish the war. He's not in a rush to go and sit for his trials. He's not in a rush to collapse his government because he gets pretty much whatever he wants. He has a right-wing government that is happy to be there right now. He's not in a rush to recruit the ultra-Orthodox into the military, which is a whole other complex. Every day that goes by that we talk about the Iran threats or the West Bank or anything else is a day we don't talk about the hostages that are a big stain on his kind of legacy. And then for the long run, I'm slightly more, well, I'll use the word pessimistic, even though, again, some people may see it differently. For the long run, the demographics in Israel are very clear. The Israel is getting more religious, more Orthodox, and if we continue with the trajectory of the emigration, it's just going to help it. So that's just numbers, the amount of numbers that the ultra-Orthodox families have, the amount of numbers that people live in areas that are more religious and less secular, the amount of numbers of people who don't join the army versus those who do. That's conversation we had 10, 15 years ago. We said, oh, in 15, 10, but you see it now in the way the parliament is broken down to areas. I don't know if Iran is the best model, but there seems to be two growing, the high-tech world, the liberal world, the I don't know, the Tel Aviv as the gay capital of the Middle East, and on the other hand, you'll have ultra-Orthodox and more yeshivas and more money that goes to that. I always give two examples in Jerusalem. There's 1 week usually, which is the gay parade in Jerusalem. You see a few thousand people show up, and then that same day is, forgive me, maybe Tet B'Av or Tet B'Av is the one where all the ultra-Orthodox once a year, they need to come to the Wailing Wall and pray for the fall of the Beit Sheni, second temple. So you see really one town with two massive contradictions. And something more current that happened in the last week actually is in the same week that the government issues orders of recruitment for people to go back to the army because there's an escalation in the north. And everywhere you read in Israel about no buses provided because it was Shabbat, no transportation because they have no money, no bus, nothing that was put to help these people. Well, at the same time, somehow they managed to fly 30,000 Israelis to Uman in Ukraine because one time a year they make some pilgrimage to pray on a grave of some, I don't even know who it is. What's in Uman in Ukraine, but once a year they go there and they live the place in a mess, and then they come back. This year they actually got stuck because there was no flight coming back. But that's something kind of if you want to visualize some of that.
You know, I think as you mentioned, like this structural problem that the state of Israel has, because it's basically the homeland of the Jews, and the Jews that were going to emigrate to Israel have done so more or less, by and large, for the last 50 years. And so the population, or the segments of the population of the Jewish diaspora that are growing, are the ultra-Orthodox.
Right.
And that's the prospect of moving to Israel was more attractive, or relatively more attractive for that part of the Jewish population, the Jewish diaspora, than we'll call it the non-Orthodox. And so this, just by law of numbers, are going to be attracting a higher rate of population growth in that sub-community, and therefore that works against demographically more of a classical liberal minded, population, right? So the numbers are against,
Right.
they're what they are.
Not against, they're trending one way, whether some people will like it and some people won't.
It's where it is. It's
And I think that puts aside the different birth rates of some of the other residents of the state of Israel.
Correct.
even, yes, exactly.
Much higher than the liberal Jewish birth rate.
Correct. I apologize, we only had 3 kids. And 2 were twins, so it doesn't even count. Yeah. What's that? The thing, we don't have time, but anyways, that's pretty much the remarks that I have ready. I have other points I'm happy to discuss. There's a lot of stuff in the news every day. There's the hostages situation, there's anti-Semitism, there's campuses. It's all kind of something that started just before we got here. Somebody sent me a clip of a woman having a rage. She stormed into some restaurant in New Jersey and tear all the Israeli flags that were there, and then somebody said, wait a second, those are Greek flags. The Greek flags are like the stripes of white. So my sister-in-law said it's like, when you anti-Semite and stupid, it's anyway, that's I'm happy to answer questions to all that, but I think that's pretty much kind of tells you what has happened in Israel in the last year, the issues that Israel is facing right now, and a little bit more of my personal story, and which I'm happy to talk more about. So
if you don't mind, I'll hop in. One of the reasons I wanted to have you speak, besides the fact that I think you're fascinating, is because I think in the Christian community, in some ways, depending on which sect of Christianity you're talking about, whether it's kind of more liberal, progressive, or more conservative, or whatever you want to say, there is almost fetishizing of Israel as this ultra-Orthodox Jewish state that is, of course, in the Christian theology, then setting itself up for Christian things to happen.
correct,
Right? Especially American Christians, really grasp the secular parts of Israel. I mean, when you just said that, it kind of struck me as there are certain, and I've never been to Israel. I know some people that are Hitchcock folks, but it just struck me as something that I wonder how much of the American Christian population recognizes Israel as something other than the
promised land.
Jewish. Does that make sense, or am I? And have you encountered that in discussions with folks?
I don't know how I'll tell you this, if you walk in Jerusalem, you'll see more Christian tourism than Jewish tourism. Am I right to say that, Rachel, at the museum? I yield my time to my wife for a second. But in Jerusalem, you see a lot of Christian tourism. When we fly to Israel, there's always Christian groups on the flights from the south, black churches, young churches. So there's definitely, and I know for a fact that there's more tourism, number-wise, Christian tourism in Israel on good years when it's quiet than Israeli tourism. In terms of how the evangelical see Israel, I don't know if they follow everything else.
The mother of his only 3 children. I I'm an art conservator with a background in archaeology, which is where Moshe and I met on an archaeological dig in Israel. As I went off to this excavation and to work in Israel for 8 months, my father yelled as I left the, like the sort of gangplank. He said, no Israelis, that's what happens when you tell your young adult daughter. So Moshe was my great archaeological find. When we moved to Israel a number of years ago so that our children would have the experience living close to their Israeli family, I wound up working at a museum in Jerusalem called the Bible Lands Museum, which is mostly an archaeological collection that focuses in not just on the land of Israel, but on the cultures of the Middle East. And it's a fascinating place with the goal of showing that there's so much more that connects all of these cultures, over millennia than sometimes separated them. But the first exhibit that we put up when I started there was actually a traveling exhibit of material that came from the Green family here in the US, which, a deeply evangelical family. They have built up a huge collection of religious texts. They have the largest collection of Torahs actually outside of the Vatican, which is a whole other interesting statistic. And they had put together this exhibit that was going to be installed in the museum. And it was a very interesting experience because I had lived in Israel for long periods of time and everything, but I was newly living there. And then these people came over from, I think they're based in Oklahoma, from the Midwest. Most of them had never been to Israel. And now they're faced with like a blonde American, woman who they weren't sure what was going on. They also arrived the day before Yom Kippur, one of the holiest days, in the Jewish calendar, where everything shuts down, and they had, no idea what was happening there. But the interesting thing that my museum, realized was that they could tap into this other deeply religious audience by having exhibitions that cater to, a Christian evangelical audience. And for the most part, I think in when we've met predominantly evangelical Christians who have very often been to Israel, what's interesting to us as, sort of liberal left-wing Jews is they tend to be supportive of the right-wing government. They tend to be further to the right politically than we are, not necessarily in America. I'm not even talking about American things, but about the Israeli government. They've, very often told us, we support all these organizations, we send money to Israel, and we have to sort of say, oh, hey, that's very interesting, because they're not necessarily, and for the most part, the things that they're supporting don't always really, the story doesn't end well for the Jews in their sort of context of what they're supporting. But it is, it is such a beautiful country. And when we lived there and we had Christian friends come to visit, it was actually for us very fascinating to go, see sites that we had never been on, our itineraries. And so there certainly is a very dynamic and heartfelt love of Israel from non-Jews.
Yeah, it's a fact. So how does that kind of play itself out politically, domestically? Both, I think I'm asking about America and Israel. Like, what is the relationship between evangelical Christianity and the Israeli state from a political perspective? And then post October 7th, I think the whole world was united in support of it. Well, not the whole world, I shouldn't say, but those of us on once were, united in support of Israel as the war has gone on. So
we'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah.
Yes. No, the liberal media. I don't know that I know how to answer that question. I don't think I haven't seen any change in the support of evangelicals and Christians in Congress or in general. I think they're still, maybe they don't go because they're nervous, but I think raising money, sending groups, I don't know that I can point to any change in the approach. I think for the most part, they still see Israel as being, in this case, the one being attacked, protecting itself on all fronts, and I don't sense that this has changed at all. If that's a short answer to a longer question, I don't think I can point out to any change like that. And we do a lot of politics, and a lot of politicians are very supportive of Israel.
Sure.
In many ways.
How does it land with Israelis, the uprise in anti-Semitic, pro-Palestinian
Here,
sentiment on college campuses, with the campus left, and I mean, it's shocking to me still, so I gotta think it's gotta land with a tremendous thud for you folks.
so in Israel, I think most people in Israel really are appalled by it.
Yeah.
Rachel and I have 2 kids in college right now, so we keep asking them about it, but after a whole year of that, I still don't get it. I really don't. It's either I downplay it for myself and I say, oh, these are idiots. These are stupid kids who don't understand what they're doing. To which someone will say, well, it doesn't mean that it's not offensive or meaningful. Even Hitler had a lot of stupid followers, right? It's not. Our kids happen to be in 2 schools that they haven't felt it as much. Surprisingly, one is a small school in Ohio, one is an engineering school that's and my second son is somewhat of a space cadet. Maybe it's there and he didn't see it. I'm just, but the point is that what struck me about this is that I think they're making something that's not. They're trying to take the conflict and all of a sudden make it about the color of your skin. It's like all of a sudden, it's like the guy who was on TV, Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? I was getting to it. I think there's all of a sudden this, oh, let's take the Arab-Israeli conflict and try to make it what it's not. They try to make it as, oh, this is black versus white. This is no, my mother was dark skinned. She came from Egypt. There's a ton of dark skinned people in Israel, not just the Ethiopian immigrants, the Moroccans, the Iraqis, that's not what it is. They try to make it about DEI, the college campuses. I've seen posters about, oh, this is about colonialism, queer rights, all the things that it's not. This conflict specifically is not about that. And they try to make it, it's about, yeah, anti-colonial, indigenous, feminism. That's not what this conflict is about. And I think that's what those kids are trying to but I wonder why is it, and so that's part of one. And the second part is I always ask myself, why now? And why Israel? Why did this push your button? If you are a 20-year-old student or kid, didn't you see enough before? Aren't Syrians killing their own people for the last 20 years? We talk about Palestinians. Palestinians have been, specifically about that book, about the Ta-Nehisi Coates, Palestinians have been B-level citizens in Lebanon for 50 years. Yeah. Palestinians don't have citizenship in Lebanon since the day they were kicked out of all the Arab countries. Where is the rage? Where is Palestinians were kicked out of Jordan, an Arab in the famous Black September, September 1970, what's known as Black September. They were put in refugee camps in Lebanon, and the Lebanese people keep them there because they don't want to give them citizenship. Talk about occupation or oppression, whatever you want to call it. Where's the rage? What about everything that's happening in other countries where, like Saudi Arabia, women's rights, gay rights? And that's where I usually kind of I'm like suspicious. Why is it that this pushes your buttons when we talk about the Jews committing the Israelis? Again, sorry, I mentioned that book. If you guys saw, there's a very famous author, Ta-Nehisi Coates. He came out with a book. He has a lot of good books, but his primary expertise is, Jim Crow in the South and race issues, right? And now he just came out with a book that part of it dealt with his trip to Israel. I think he was there for 15 days. He claimed that he's been studying it for a year and a half. He also went to, I think, South Africa, whatever. South Carolina? Senegal. And then he also spent time in Gabon. Anyways, the point is he was making and so then doing one of the interviews that he had on one of the networks, we're not going to mention, but it was CBS. He was asked some tough questions about the book. It was 7 minutes. And it created this media storm. Why was he pushed so hard? Why was he pushed so hard about Israel? He was accused of being an extremist. He was accused of, and I was again fascinated by how, and the interviewer a few days later was reprimanded. Yeah, he was told that he didn't follow standards or whatever. And again, I looked at it from a way of why did it create such a big storm in a way that because why is this specific topic always pushing people buttons when it's been out there for a long time? I mean, good for him for wanting to write about this, but it happens to be that the interviewer, the CBS guy, is Jewish, he's divorced and his wife lives in Israel with his 2 kids. And I know him because his wife works for MSNBC, but the tone and everything, the way he was attacked for asking some serious questions about the author's intentions and the author's definition of Israel. And he was told that he should have kept his biases out the door, the interviewer, this guy, Tony Dokapil. And it puzzled me. Can you imagine a Black correspondent challenging someone who just wrote a book about affirmative action? Let's say somebody wrote a book that he doesn't like affirmative action, or it's time to end affirmative action, or whatever his opinion is. Can you imagine a Black interviewer ask him some tough questions and then being told, you should have kept your Blackness out the door. When you come to work at CBS, you should keep your biases out the door. No. Can you imagine somebody writing a book anti-gay rights and being asked about the book by a gay reporter? Can you imagine somebody telling the gay reporter, keep your gayness out the door when you walked into the hall of this news organization? You should keep your but when it comes to Israel, when it comes to sometimes people do things that I don't know how to explain it.
Well, it sounds, I think you're expressing what we would probably observe as a higher standard. It was being held to a higher standard.
Or a different standard. I don't know. It's
different
high.
standard. Yeah, different standard. And it's been that way for 30, 40, 50 years.
Okay.
And so it's not new, but I think the conflict has allowed us to bubble up in society again, right?
And I don't know if it answers your question because every college is probably different. Some of them are in Colombia. We know it's heavily sponsored by outsiders who bring the tents and bring the money. There's other in UPenn. We know it's some colleges. It's more kind of spontaneous by a few people who will just put together a table and some flyers. So, but I don't know what it is. Young kids at age of 20 look for a cause, look for something to be upset about. Maybe they blame us for global warming or whatever we did do. I don't know. So maybe that's part of it.
I will say, our son, who is in a small liberal arts college in Ohio, which has a very small percentage of Jews, and I think he's one of 2 Israeli American, kids. And in the spring, a friend of his who is Jewish, his girlfriend came and said, "We are going to go," and there was a bus going to take kids to join the protest at Ohio State, which was one of the campuses that had active sort of an encampment, and they were going to go protest there. And they came by to ask if Micah wanted to go with them. And he looked at them, he said, "Are you serious?" When you're wandering around the state, they were protesting on Kenyon's campus with 2,000 kids. He said, when you're wandering around and, saying, hey, ho, ho, colonials, Israel has got to go. My family go, I understand what you're doing.
think we're starting to characterize every protester in America as being river to the sea protesters. And I think the media, let's face it, excuse me, anyone who's in the media,
No, please.
they're there to sell stuff like everybody else. They're gonna get the sexiest story they can find.
Correct.
But I would question whether, I totally get that, the microscope on Israeli behavior is way more focused than it is on Darfur or Lebanon. Over my lifetime. However, truly, and I hesitate to say this because anytime you say anything, it could be perceived as anti-Semitic.
Right.
There are things the Israeli government is doing that are very, very wrong in my opinion.
Absolutely.
And I believe in that doesn't mean that I'm anti-Semitic, that I'm against the sovereignty of Israel. You know what I mean? So,
Absolutely.
and I think that, so again, going back to the media, I think the media goes and finds, where's that protester who is saying these horrible things? Let's focus on that.
Correct.
So that's my worry about that whole characterization of
And,
protests.
and I'm happy you said that because every time we have a conversation at home with our kids, whatever, I always tell my daughter, we have nothing against the Palestinians. Honestly, this is not an anti-Palestinian. Yeah, the Palestinians have the right to live where they live. We have nothing against them. Those in Gaza, those in the West Bank. This is not, we hate all, we are against Hamas, against Hezbollah, against people who want to kill us. And you'll hear plenty of criticism of the Israeli government in our house, trust me. Yeah, the big elephant in the room is the West Bank. Gaza was easy. Israel retreated out of Gaza. Israel hasn't been to Gaza in 20 years, and we have nothing to do with Gaza. Lebanon is even simpler. There's no territorial arguments with Lebanon. Israel wants nothing to do with Lebanon. And the Lebanese, by the way, want nothing to do with Israel. The fact that they were taken over by Hezbollah 40 years ago. So that's the West Bank is where the core of it is, because by Israeli definition, it's a military occupied area. Israeli definition, not, so Israel itself says this is a military occupied territory, and a lot of Israelis have an issue with that. So you are very right that Israel, you're right, when the UN decides to spend I don't know how many resolutions against Israel, sometimes it's kind of funny to see how of all the issues in the world they decide to spend so much time against Israel. But you are right that there are things, absolutely, I'll agree with you, that Israel does, especially in the West Bank, that it shouldn't. If that's,
How do people that live in Israel, how does Israeli citizens who are liberal, how, what is their sense of all of that? Is it, like, for instance, left wing, let's say, Israeli, do they have similar revulsion to Netanyahu that
absolutely.
we liberals have revulsion to the unnamed person?
The unnamed, orange person. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
The last year before October 7, there were massive demonstrations against Netanyahu.
Right.
Everyone on my social media feed, every Saturday night shows up in every from my family to absolutely. And unfortunately, because maybe what I said before about demographics, it's shrinking, the Israeli left, but the Israeli center left is still live and very, very much against it. Absolutely.
Yes.
Intelligence did on October 7th related to the fact that, they tried to keep quiet for the last couple of years to plan and, to enable the October 7th attack to be as deadly as it was, that they really saw that the left-wing government and the protests by
Right wing.
no.
Right.
That the left-wing population and this sort of like center left of the country was against Netanyahu for this last year really helped sort of distract the government against what was brewing in Gaza. So, but yeah, but yeah. And I just one other thing, just to address, Reverend Pete, what you said about the evangelical community and the politics is that I think there's no way to disconnect it from what we're seeing here and the lead up to our election and what Trump is trying to do and sort of detract, taking, for the most part, the Jews are a heavily Democratic vote, heavily Democratic, and there's been a lot of attempt, credit to the Trump administration for things like the Abraham Accords, but for the most part, there's been a real attempt to bolster the right-wing government of Netanyahu in ways that American Jews and the Israeli, center and left find extraordinarily troubling. Because in the end, you're right, there is a way to be supportive of Israel and Jews and to say the military occupation of the West Bank has gone on for too long. And there are,
It doesn't benefit Israel.
it's a moral cancer on Israel, in our opinion, and that many of the reasons why people are against Israel have to do, with this idea of the ongoing occupation. And if we could figure out a way to extract Israel from that and give Palestinians a better, stable, more, peaceful life, which includes removing the terrible, settler violence that, that goes on by right-wing Israelis, I think Israel would have a stronger moral position.
Sure. Oh, go first. Sure. Somebody go. Okay. Well, this, I think, my question, emerges from some of the things that Rachel just said. My worry as a person who, number one, identifies as a relatively secular Zionist, who's lost a lot of friends since October 7th on both sides. In other words, I have friends doing local community activism who tell me, and when I try to correct them, they don't even want to talk to me, that Israel is a colonialist enterprise from the beginning. And I say, you don't know the history. Let me at least ask you to understand why I think that's an absurd statement. And, they're like, no, we're not anti-Jewish, we're not anti-Semitic, but you're going to have to give up your love of Israel, which I refuse to do. And on the other hand, I have friends or people I still regard as friends who say to me, you Jewish American Israelis, people who identify as Zionists are irrelevant. Because as you described very clearly, there's a beginning to be a drain on more secular, more liberal, even religious Jews from Israel, who are very successful professionals, a part of whom have made the economy stronger and more powerful and more democratic, quite frankly. And your so-called group, I read Haaretz, which is sort of the left wing, the people who don't know, Jewish newspaper, at least that's my understanding of it, and I find it very helpful. And I have former students of mine who work for AIPAC and who tell me, we understand that you have this idealistic view, but it's out of date. And frankly, you should get behind Netanyahu because he is the future of Israel. And I say, that's as absurd to me as people who tell me that Zionism is a colonialist enterprise. But I wonder about a future for people who are progressive, who believe there needs to be a Jewish state, a Jewish homeland in Israel. But at the same time, I've only been to Israel once, and I helped to build playgrounds for Palestinians in the West Bank. and we were observed by the IDF. And our rabbi, who's now retired, who brought us there, when we worried that somehow or another, we weren't going to be able to go back to Israel because the IDF had our names down, she said, if anybody has to worry, it's me. This was Shira Milgram. She said, you have nothing to worry about. She said, you don't count, which I just thought was kind of amusing. But I wonder about the future of a primarily secular and, for lack of a better word, inclusive Israel for Jews who are not ultra Orthodox.
No. So I think that takes us back to no, I think that was very helpful. Thank you. I think that takes us back to how you started this, that things are not black and white,
Right.
that there's a gray area. And so I guess how can Americans, because we talk a lot about evangelical Christianity, and in some ways, there's certain sects within Christianity that make life extraordinarily difficult to be a minister. But that being said, for the majority of Christianity that is not in that kind of vein of things, now how can we? Because I have, as Steve said, I have a lot of problems with Benjamin Netanyahu, and as you said, and with some of the way that the war's been carried out in Gaza, I think has been horrific in a lot of ways, and the stopping of humanitarian aid and why is it, I guess, is what I'm asking, that for Israel, what I always find interesting is that you can't separate the government from all Jews for some reason in people's heads. Right. And it just strikes me as bizarre that as a Jewish person or as a Christian person, to critique Benjamin Netanyahu is definitely to open yourself up to anti-Semitism.
Right.
If I go online, if I go on Facebook right now and say Benjamin Netanyahu is committing war crimes, I would be ostracized as an anti-Semitic. But I think pretty objectively, you could say that and make that argument. So how can we talk about Israel as a government and a state apart from the religion of Judaism? Is that even possible? I guess is what I'm asking.
I think it was possible before October 7. Before October 7, the whole year leading to October 7. That's exactly what
That's what was happening.
Yeah, that's exactly what the Israelis were doing. Nobody and people were blamed for being anti-country, traitors, and the usual kind of classic. This is basically the state of Israel was in turmoil in that year. So people have tried to take the country back, kind of. The Israeli, center and center left and secular against Netanyahu. Yeah. Netanyahu has been in power so many years now. Yeah. Corruption is everywhere. Obviously, he failed even in the one thing that he kept promising is that he's missile security. Well, October 7 is going to be on his Wikipedia entry for whether he wants it or not. So I think there's hope there. Maybe when I described the future, I was a little bit pessimistic because of the demographics. I just hope that people can learn to live separately. Like, so until now, there's certain areas you don't have buses on Shabbat, on the Holy Saturday. Fine, if that's what they want, that's fine. But let the rest of the country who want to have that, who wants to go to the beach on Saturday, who wants to, if you want to have a restaurant that doesn't have the stamp of the kosher, for many, many years, I think Israel has managed to find a way to live peacefully, peacefully.
And I think that's fascinating, and that's the other side of that. Correct. America has Israel in a way that is separate from anti-Semitism. Okay, correct. Right? Yes. I'm legitimately asking.
Right. Well, it depends who you're speaking to.
Depends on who you're speaking to. Okay. And who's doing the speaking. Yeah.
We have in this room, this very different we have space. Oh, I forgot.
Go ahead.
Just to follow on that a little bit, was last year at, I think it was during, was it during, around Passover? Somebody had a Facebook post that really resonated with me, with someone who said, as I walk through these encampments on college campuses and find that there is no camp for me, because as someone who, loves Israel, who believes that Israel, has a right to defend itself, it believes in, in Zionism, but yet is uncomfortable with the things that have happened and are being done now, and with this black and white mentality of, what does that mean? Like, how can we have a conversation here where someone can express real discomfort with how this war is being prosecuted, and, and have an Israeli not feel like they're being attacked, because, we would agree more with you than with Ben Gvir or Smotrich, the two of the right-wing ministers who every time they open up their mouth, I feel are like it's a war crime.
Yeah.
So
my daughter is at the University of Pittsburgh, which has had a lot of,
it has,
a lot of this, and she's been witness to it. And her boyfriend from Scarsdale, who is Jewish, has come to visit a lot and been on campus when some of these protests have been happening. And I was there one weekend when there were a lot of protests, and what I found very fascinating was that there were several protests, several encampments, kind of, and one of them was like, drum circle at, I don't know, some hippie gathering that just everybody wanted to love each other and find as many illicit drugs as possible, I think. But they were having fun, and everybody was welcome and everybody was loved, right? And then there was a very different encampment that you could tell had a energy to it that was much more anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. And now the one that was welcoming was much larger.
Right.
In recent weeks, Katie, my daughter, has called me describing walking through the main quad of campus, and there being those two separate encampments, but now both of them are on the extreme side. There's one extreme kind of pro-Israel, and Zionist, any negative thing you say about Netanyahu or this government of Israel makes you evil. On the other side, it's, Palestinian flags and from the rivers at sea, right? And the gray area that you described is just gone. It's been obliterated. And I found that to be a fascinating kind of parable for what we're talking about.
And I think one of the things that is interesting about that is going back to many of our Israeli, friends and family keep asking, how are we doing over here with what's going on? And because they genuinely see that they are fighting a battle against, either the Iranian and, proxies, and against Islamic extremism. And that's what, when they see, people with keffiyehs vandalizing things in the US, they are like, you Americans don't understand what's coming. And whether that's true or not, I think to understand, as Moshe said, the fact that Israelis are living under constant, bombardment, that there is constant, fear, and that most Americans, even those of us who've lived through 9/11, really have no concept of what it is like, to live there all the time, or, especially now. And I will say, just to address your question, it's also from the first year that I lived in Israel, which was in '94. I worked in East Jerusalem in an archaeological institute, and you would see, young women wearing jeans and everything, and it was a very different city than it was, like 20 years ago, where the Christian population, and mostly the Christian Arab population, over the last, couple of decades has gone.
Gone.
They've all emigrated to, the Palestinian friends that I have here are all Christian families who have left, and because they did not see the demographics in the, West Bank and Jerusalem going in their direction. And so, when you talk about, what can Americans do and how we feel uncomfortable or, with things, I think what I would say is that like when we've met these people who said like, oh, we donated to this organization and we were a little, uncomfortable, is to really make sure that you understand organizations that you're giving. There are amazing Christian groups within Israel that do, wonderful work. There's, we are, supporters of, some organizations that really represent the values that we want to see in Israel. We don't give to AIPAC, we don't, there's a lot of things that we do not support. And so I think there are ways to support the kind of values that you are important to you. If you take the time to understand where the money's really going.
And the issue of extracting, the same thing you said about genes and the same thing could be said for Iran and Saudi Arabia. And, that there have been times throughout the history where, and then all of a sudden the move toward extremism, one way or the other, extremism is bad. Yeah. Okay.
No,
I think we're pretty much.
yeah, I hope it hasn't been too negative or too, no, I believe, to finish here, I believe there's, I believe in coexistence, and I believe that at the core we're very similar, way more than we are different. When I go to visit my parents, my father, hopefully when the Galilee is an area it's one big coexistence hub. It's Israelis, Arabs, and Druze. Druze is like another form of, it's hard to explain, but it's like Arab villages, and it's really coexistence. Like half of the people who work in the kibbutz come from the Arab villages, from the Jews. If you want a good hummus, you go to the Arab village. If I take my dad to visit at the hospital, I would say half of the nurses are Arabs. The hospital in Sfat, the manager is Arab. There's really a lot of coexistence in that area. Way more, by the way, than there is coexistence with the Jewish Orthodox. Who live in the area, who have nothing to do with, so I just believe that, and to your point about Christian, and I'll finish on that maybe, 10 years ago, I got a call from my boss at NBC, and she said, I have your new assignment. And I said, oh, what is that? I want you to work with the Reverend Al Sharpton. He has a television show. And I said, oh, really? Why would that work? He's a black civil rights leader from Brooklyn, a man of God. I'm a white Jew from the Galilee. I'm kind of an atheist. I don't see the connection there. And Yvette, this boss of mine who knew me for many years, you know what? I know it's going to work. Just give it a try. Be in charge of his television show. And here I am, 10 years later, still working with him. I love the guy. I love the team. I love the product we put on the air. I think we have much more in common in general. Humanity kind of, and this is the best example. We care about basic human rights, freedom of choice, freedom of expression. We care about, just treating each other with respect, and that's kind of what he's for. That's what I believe I'm for. And here we are working together all these years, and I really, I may be an optimist, but I really think that's one of the reasons why that's working, and we have staff that's very diverse. But I really truly believe that's the key. And she must have known. She knew something. She knew something is. She was.
Red Al, he ever needs to talk to me about anything. This context matters and setting matters. And I think the setting that the context that really matters is trust and love. Love, with all world could do that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank